How many people can disappear before their absence stops mattering? In the early 1800s, the answer along the Mississippi River was simple: more than anyone could count. Men vanished every day, sometimes every night, and the world barely paused to notice. No headlines followed them. No courts asked questions. No families received certainty. One moment a man would be drinking on the deck of a flatboat, laughing loudly about debts he never intended to pay or crimes he was proud to have committed. The next moment, he was simply gone. No body, no witness. Just an empty space where a person used to be, quickly filled by someone else. The Mississippi River was not just a trade route. It was the perfect eraser. It carried cotton, whiskey, timber, and opportunity, but it also carried away accountability. In the 1830s, the river was a moving frontier, a place where law dissolved the moment a boat pushed off from shore. There were no passenger lists, no reliable records, no consistent authority from one port to the next. A man could change his name as easily as his destination. Violence was common, but rarely investigated. If someone fell overboard, it was called an accident. If a fight ended badly, it was called bad luck. And if a man never arrived at the next port, the explanation was always the same: the river took him. The Mississippi became a convenient answer to questions no one wanted to ask. It allowed crimes to go unpunished and confessions to be spoken freely because everyone believed the water would carry them away. But what if someone was listening when others weren't? What if, in a place where the law failed to follow, one quiet figure decided that memory itself was a form of justice? Hidden among the noise and chaos of the docks was a man whose job made him invisible, a simple river clerk who recorded cargo by day and watched people by habit. He never raised his voice, never carried a weapon, never laid a hand on anyone. Yet again and again, the men who crossed his path were the same men who never reached their next destination. Dozens of disappearances. No witnesses, no proof, just patterns that no one bothered to connect. For years, the river kept its secret, until long after the disappearances stopped, when a flood peeled back the past and revealed something never meant to be found. A ledger water damaged, heavy, and silent. Not a shipping record, not a list of goods, but a book filled with names, dates, judgments, a record of who vanished and why. Because the Mississippi may hide bodies, but it does not forget. And neither did the man who kept score. By 1838, America was growing faster than it could control itself. The country was expanding westward, driven by trade, ambition, and desperation. And nowhere was that expansion more visible or more dangerous than along its rivers. The Mississippi River was the backbone of the nation's economy, a moving highway that connected frontier towns to global markets. Flatboats and steamers carried cotton, lumber, whiskey, and livestock south toward New Orleans, while returning north with money, supplies, and men chasing opportunity. River towns sprang up overnight, crowded with traders, gamblers, laborers, and fugitives. Order existed only in fragments, and authority rarely traveled farther than the edge of the dock. Rivers, like the Mississippi, were perfect places for crime, not because they were hidden, but because they were too open. There were no borders on the water, no consistent sheriffs, no unified records. Each port followed its own rules, if it followed any at all. Passenger lists were uncommon. Identification meant little. A man's past stayed behind once the boat left shore. Violence blended into the noise of commerce. Disputes over money, cargo, or pride were settled quickly and quietly, and if someone disappeared, the explanation was simple and convenient. The river took him. Water erased evidence, carried away witnesses, and left behind nothing that demanded accountability. This environment created something dangerous, a belief that consequences were optional. Men spoke freely because they believed they were already untouchable. Crimes were confessed casually, sometimes even proudly, because no one expected those words to matter. The river gave people permission to be their worst selves, confident that no record would survive them. And in most cases, they were right. This story is fictional, but the fear behind it is not. Throughout American history, rivers have been places where people vanished without answers. They represent movement, escape, and renewal, but also silence. The idea that someone could disappear completely, leaving no trace except memory, is one of the oldest anxieties tied to frontier life. This story takes that fear and asks a disturbing question. When the law refuses to remember, who decides what justice looks like? Because when systems fail, order doesn't vanish, it changes form. Someone always steps in to decide what matters, what is forgiven, and what is not. Sometimes that person wears a badge. Sometimes they carry a weapon. And sometimes they carry nothing more than a pen and the patience to listen. That is where this story truly begins. Not in a courtroom or a jail, but at a quiet stretch of riverfront in Natchez, Mississippi. At dock number 3, where cargo was weighed, boats were cleared for departure, and a clerk worked each day without drawing attention. A place so ordinary no one thought to watch it closely. A place where numbers were written down carefully and where, unseen by anyone else, something far more unsettling was being recorded. Life on the Mississippi River in the 1830s followed its own rules shaped by motion, money, and the understanding that nothing stayed still for long. From dawn until long after sunset, flatboats crowded the water, their wooden hulls heavy with cotton bales, barrels of whiskey, sacks of grain, and anything else that could be sold downstream. These boats were slow, ungainly, and disposable. Many would never make the return trip north. They were built to float, to drift, and eventually to be broken apart and sold for lumber once they reached their final port. The men aboard them were often much the same, temporary, replaceable, and passing through. Daily life on the river was loud and restless. Crews worked hard during daylight hours, pushing off sandbars, repairing leaks, and loading cargo at every stop. When night fell, the river transformed. Whiskey bottles appeared. Card games formed on crate tops. Dice rolled across planks, slick with river mist. Money changed hands quickly, and so did tempers. Gambling debts piled up faster than wages, and arguments were common. Violence was not shocking. It was expected. Fights broke out over cards, over winning, over insults barely remembered the next morning. Most ended with bruises. Some ended with men nursing broken bones, and a few ended with someone never being seen again. What made the river especially dangerous was not just the violence, but the freedom it offered from identity. On land, a reputation could follow a man for years. On the river, it lasted only as long as the next port. Names were fluid. Stories were invented. A man could be a laborer in one town, a trader in the next, and a nobody by morning. There were no standardized documents, no photographs, no centralized records. If someone asked who you were, you answered however you pleased. And if no one asked, even better. This fluidity made disappearance easy. A man could simply walk off a dock and never return. He could switch boats, change routes, or claim a new name. If he owed money, if he had committed violence, if he was running from something, the river welcomed him without judgment. And if the river took him through a fall, a fight, or a quiet push, there would be no investigation worth the name. Bodies sank quickly in the muddy current. Sometimes they surfaced miles away, bloated and unrecognizable. Often, they never surfaced at all. Because of this, disappearances became normal. They were woven into the rhythm of river life. Crews adjusted without ceremony. A missing man meant more work for those who remained, but little more than that. Captains were reluctant to report losses that might delay their schedules or invite questions. Merchants cared about cargo, not crew. Towns along the river learned not to ask too much, because answers brought responsibility, and responsibility slowed trade. Families back home waited for letters that never arrived. Some assumed betrayal. Others assumed death, Most never knew which was worse. Newspapers occasionally mentioned missing men, but without details, without follow-up. The river offered too many explanations and demanded none. Over time, this silence shaped behavior. Men spoke openly about things they would never admit on land. They bragged about cheating partners, abandoning injured companions during storms, or settling disputes with knives when no one was watching. They spoke because they believed no one was listening, and because even if someone did hear them, it would not matter. The river had taught them that truth dissolved as easily as footprints in mud. Yet beneath this chaos ran an unspoken understanding. The river was not just a road. It was also a boundary. It separated the remembered from the forgotten. It carried opportunity, but it also collected consequences. Every river town had its stories, places where boats slowed unexpectedly, bends where accidents seemed to happen more often, stretches of water locals avoided at night. The Mississippi was respected, even feared, not because it was evil, but because it was final. It was both highway and grave, a lifeline and a last stop. And in this world, where disappearance required no explanation and violence left no paperwork, the greatest danger was not being killed. It was being erased, forgotten so completely that it was as if you had never existed at all. That was the true power of the river. It did not need to be cruel. It only needed to keep moving. Most people accepted this without question, but not everyone. Somewhere amid the noise, the gambling, the drunken confessions, and the quiet vanishing of men, there were those who noticed patterns. Those who understood that when nothing is recorded, someone decides what counts and what doesn't. And at one small dock in Natchez, in the middle of all this motion, there was a man whose job was to write things down, living in a world where almost nothing ever was. Elias Crow was the kind of man people forgot the moment he stepped out of view. If asked to describe him, most would hesitate, offering vague details that barely formed a picture. Average height, slim build, brown hair already thinning at the temples, despite his middle age. He dressed plainly, always in the same muted tones that blended into the river dock's dusty browns. Faded grays, a wool coat worn smooth at the elbows. There was nothing about him that invited attention, and that was precisely how he preferred it. Elias spoke softly, never more than necessary. His voice carried no authority, no challenge, no warmth that encouraged familiarity. He did not swear. He did not joke. He did not complain. When spoken to, he listened, nodded, and returned to his work. This restraint made people comfortable around him. Silence, especially in a loud place like the docks, felt harmless. Men talked freely in his presence because Elias did not feel like an audience. He felt like furniture. His habits were consistent to the point of predictability. He arrived at dock number 3 before sunrise each morning, unlocking the small office where the port ledger was kept. He sharpened his pencil carefully, aligned his papers, and reviewed the previous day's entries with meticulous care. Cargo weights, departure times, port fees, everything was written neatly, evenly spaced, never rushed. Mistakes were rare, corrections even rarer. Captains appreciated this. Merchants depended on it. In a world where chaos ruled, Elias represented reliability. That reliability earned trust. Boat captains waved him aboard without hesitation. Traders handed him manifests without question. He was not suspected because he had never given anyone a reason to suspect him. He never drank with the crews, never joined the gambling circles, never lingered after work to gossip. This distance was interpreted as professionalism, even virtue. Elias Crow was the kind of man people believed could not be involved in trouble because he seemed untouched by desire. But distance was not absence. Elias noticed everything. He noticed which men argued over cards night after night, their voices growing louder as debts piled up. He noticed which traders treated crewmen as expendable, speaking of them as tools rather than people. He noticed who laughed when recounting violence and who spoke carefully watching for reactions. He noticed patterns: who traveled alone, who moved often, who never spoke of family or home. He noticed because listening was easy when no one expected it. His position as a port clerk placed him at the center of movement without ever being part of it. He knew which boats arrived late, which left early, which were heavier than they should have been. He saw names written down, crossed out, replaced. He saw the gaps: missing crew members who were never officially reported. He saw how quickly absences were normalized, how little anyone wanted to slow down long enough to ask questions. Elias did not judge openly. He never confronted anyone, but his mind recorded details with the same precision he used in his work: dates, names, locations, words spoken casually, then forgotten by the men who said them. He believed memory was a form of responsibility, and he took that responsibility seriously. At night, when the docks emptied and the noise faded, Elias returned to his rented room of a shuttered fish shop. The room was sparse: a narrow bed, a small table, a single chair, and a lamp. No decorations. No personal items beyond what was necessary. This too made him unremarkable. A man with nothing worth stealing, nothing worth noticing. But beneath the loose floorboards was where Elias kept what mattered. He had always believed that the river did not act randomly. Growing up near the water, he had learned to respect its patterns: how weight shifted, how currents pulled, how small decisions could have irreversible consequences. The river punished carelessness, arrogance, and excess. Elias believed people revealed themselves in the same way. Long before something happened, the conditions were already set. The ledger he kept at night was not born of anger or revenge. It was born of observation. Elias did not see himself as powerful. He saw himself as precise, as necessary. In a world that refused to remember, someone had to. And because no one ever noticed him, no one thought to stop him. That was the true danger of Elias Crow. Not that he was cruel, not that he was violent, but that he was invisible in a place where invisibility allowed truth to pass unchallenged. While others shouted, gambled, and vanished, Elias watched. And in watching, he began to understand something unsettling. When everyone assumes no one is paying attention, the one who becomes the most dangerous person in the room. The Mississippi River was loud during the day, but it was at night that men truly revealed themselves. When the work was finished and the boats were tied off, the docks transformed into places of confession disguised as entertainment. Whiskey bottles were passed hand to hand. Card games formed in uneven circles. Dice clattered against wooden planks. Voices grew looser, then louder, carried by the damp night air and the slow, steady movement of the river itself. Men talked because talking filled the silence, and because they believed nothing spoken on the river could follow them beyond it. Boasting was the most common language. A man might brag about cheating a partner out of wages, laughing as if cleverness excused cruelty. Another would recount a fight from upriver, describing how an argument ended with someone bleeding and left behind. These stories were told casually, as entertainment, stripped of consequence. The river had taught them that nothing lasted, not anger, not memory. Tomorrow, they would be somewhere else. New port, new faces, new name, if necessary. Confession often came wrapped in alcohol. As bottles emptied, tongues loosened. Men spoke of debts they never intended to pay, of cargo stolen and resold, of passengers pushed aside when storms turned violent. Sometimes the admissions were quiet, spoken to no one in particular. Other times, they were shouted proudly, daring anyone to object. But no one did. Objecting meant responsibility, and responsibility slowed things down. On the river, speed mattered more than morality. Arguments brought out darker truths. When gambling debts piled up and tempers flared, accusations spilled into the open. One man would accuse another of cheating. The accused would respond by revealing secrets meant to shame or intimidate, names of towns, names of victims. Thieves that had never been punished because no one had been there to care. The river bore witness to all of it, its surface reflecting lantern light as if it were watching too. And always, somewhere nearby, was Elias Crow. He never inserted himself into these conversations. He did not stand at the center of the group or linger too close. He positioned himself just within earshot, close enough to hear, but far enough to be ignored. Sometimes he was finishing paperwork by lamplight. Sometimes he was checking cargo tallies late into the evening. His presence was expected, routine, uninteresting. Men lowered their voices for captains or guards. They never lowered them for Elias. To them, he was not a person. He was a fixture, a clerk, someone who dealt in numbers, not people. Elias listened without reaction. He did not flinch at violence or cruelty. He did not show approval or disgust. His face remained neutral, his posture relaxed. This calm encouraged more talking. Silence, when unchallenged, feels like permission. Men assumed Elias wasn't paying attention, or worse, that he wouldn't understand what he was hearing. They mistook his quiet for emptiness. But Elias was listening in a way few people ever did. He did not just hear words. He absorbed context. He noted how easily certain men spoke about harming others, how often the same names surfaced in stories of exploitation or abandonment. He noticed patterns in tone, who bragged, who justified, who laughed, who never used names at all. He noticed how some men spoke of violence as necessity, while others spoke of it as sport. To Elias, these distinctions mattered. Over time, he began to believe that the river itself was listening too. Elias had grown up watching the Mississippi. He had seen storms roll in without warning, seen boats run aground after small miscalculations, seen strong swimmers pulled under by unseen currents. The river responded to imbalance. Too much weight, too much speed, too much carelessness. It did not punish out of malice, it corrected. Men, Elias believed, were no different. They revealed imbalance in their words long before it showed in their actions. The river heard those words. It carried them downstream, holding on to them in its endless motion. And when conditions were right, it responded. Elias did not think of himself as judge or executioner. He thought of himself as a witness, someone who ensured that what was spoken did not dissolve into nothing. Because to let these words vanish felt like complicity. Silence, he believed, was not neutral. It favored those who believed themselves untouchable. Late at night, after the voices faded and the docks emptied, Elias returned to his room. There, away from the river's edge, he would sit quietly for long periods before doing anything at all. He replayed conversations in his mind, word for word. He considered them carefully. Not every confession mattered. Not every boast deserved attention. Some men spoke foolishly, exaggerating for effect. Elias learned to distinguish noise from truth. Only when he was certain did he reach beneath the loose floorboards. He never rushed this part. The act of writing required precision, care, intent. Whatever he was recording was not meant for anyone else to see, not yet. The book he kept was not large, and it was never left open. Its pages were treated with the same respect he gave the official port ledger. This was not a diary. It was not a list of crimes. It was something quieter, heavier. But for now, Elias kept its existence to himself. By day, he remained the invisible clerk. By night, he became something else entirely, someone who refused to let words disappear just because the river made it easy. As the Mississippi continued to carry men south, their confessions floating behind them like shadows, Elias listened, because he believed that when people speak freely, they are telling you exactly who they are. And someone somewhere should remember that. The ledger was never meant to be seen. Elias Crow treated it with a care that bordered on reverence, not because it was fragile, but because of what it represented. It was small enough to be hidden easily, bound in dark, cracked leather that had softened with age and humidity. The edges of its pages were uneven, slightly swollen from the damp air that clung to everything near the river. Ink had bled faintly into the fibers, giving each word a shadow, as if the page itself were remembering more than it should. This was not a book meant to impress or endure public handling. It was meant to exist quietly, away from eyes, away from judgment, except one. Elias kept the ledger beneath loose floorboards in his rented room, wrapped in cloth to protect it from moisture and curiosity. He never removed it during the day. He never carried it with him. It did not travel the river the way the official port ledger did. This book stayed in one place, waiting. To Elias, that mattered. It was not part of commerce or movement. It was an anchor, something that held truth still in a world that refused to stop moving. When Elias opened the ledger, he did so slowly. There was no rush, no emotion in the gesture. He believed haste led to mistakes, and mistakes dishonored what he was trying to preserve. The pages were mostly empty at first, filled gradually over years. Each entry followed the same structure, always written in the same careful hand. There were no long explanations, no dramatic language, just a name, a date, a port, and a single sentence. And most striking of all, there were no crimes listed. Elias did not describe what a man had done in detail. He did not explain circumstances or motives. He did not argue guilt or innocence. To him, the crime itself was less important than the truth of the person. The ledger did not exist to persuade or prove. It existed to remember. Writing down a name was not about cataloging wrongdoing. It was about refusing to let someone pass through the world without being seen clearly, even once. Elias believed that most systems of justice failed because they focused too much on punishment and too little on truth. Courts required witnesses, evidence, procedure. On the river, none of that survived. By the time anyone cared, it was already too late. But memory could exist without permission. It could exist quietly, privately, without needing approval from anyone else. In Elias's mind, the ledger was not a weapon. It was a mirror. He believed that when a man spoke freely about cruelty or exploitation, when he laughed about harming others or abandoning them to the river, he was already passing judgment on himself. Elias did not decide guilt. He recorded acknowledgement. The ledger did not condemn, it confirmed. And confirmation, Elias believed, was more powerful than accusation. This belief shaped everything about how he used the book. He never wrote in anger. He never added names impulsively. Days, sometimes weeks, passed between hearing a confession and recording it. Elias listened again and again in his memory, testing the weight of the words. Some names were never written. Some confessions, he decided, were born of bravado rather than truth. Others were the result of fear or drink. Elias did not see himself as infallible. That was why he was careful. Only when he was certain that a man had revealed something real, something that spoke to who he was when he believed no one was watching, did Elias open the ledger. Judgment, to Elias, did not mean punishment in the traditional sense. He did not believe in vengeance. He did not believe suffering balanced suffering. He believed punishment was noisy and temporary. It satisfied anger, but it did not preserve truth. Memory, on the other hand, was permanent. Being remembered for what you truly were was a sentence that never ended. This was the heart of his philosophy. A person could escape the law, escape consequence, escape even their own name, but they could not escape being known if someone chose to remember them. The ledger ensured that escape was incomplete. Elias never imagined the ledger as something that would be used against anyone. He did not expect it to bring arrests or closure. In fact, he believed the opposite. The ledger was not meant to change the world. It was meant to balance it. A quiet correction in a place that refused to correct itself. In this way, Elias saw himself not as judge or executioner, but as custodian. He kept what the river would otherwise carry away. He believed the Mississippi was honest, but indifferent. It responded to imbalance, but it did not care about meaning. Elias supplied meaning. He gave weight to words spoken too easily. He gave permanence to lives that would otherwise dissolve into rumor. Every time he closed the ledger, Elias felt no relief, no satisfaction, only responsibility. The book grew heavier with time, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it contained. Each name represented a truth that could never be undone. And Elias understood that once written, there was no erasing it, not even by him. That was the finality of it. Not death, not disappearance, but being recorded exactly once, exactly as you were, by someone who refused to look away. In a world where no one wanted to remember, Elias Crow chose to remember everything. And to him, that choice was not cruelty. It was order. The disappearances did not begin with alarm. They began the way most things on the Mississippi did, quietly, without ceremony, folded into the rhythm of river life. The first man to vanish was a gambler known only by a nickname that changed depending on the port. He drank hard, cheated openly, and laughed when confronted. One night in Natchez, he argued loudly over cards, accusing another man of marking the deck. The argument ended unresolved. By morning, his bunk was empty. His boots were still beneath it. The boat pushed off on schedule. Someone joked that the river had finally collected its debt. No one asked where he'd gone. A few weeks later, a trader disappeared near Vicksburg. He had a reputation for cruelty using crewmen until they collapsed, then replacing them without pay. He boasted about it, calling it efficiency. He was last seen boarding a flatboat heavier than it should have been, delayed by paperwork and an inspection that ran late into the evening. The next port reported him missing. The captain blamed illness. Others blamed whiskey. The explanation barely mattered. The cargo arrived intact. Trade continued. Then came a man near Greenville, a quiet one, who spoke little but drank heavily. When he did speak, it was to confess never directly, never all at once. He hinted at a fight upriver that had gone too far, at a body left behind in the reeds. One night, after a storm rolled in unexpectedly, he fell overboard. Or was pushed. No one could say. The river was high and fast. By dawn, there was no sign he had ever existed beyond a name scribbled in a crew list that no one bothered to keep. Each disappearance was dismissed on its own terms. Accidents happened. Storms happened. Men made mistakes. The river was dangerous. There was no secret. To connect these events would require slowing down, asking questions, caring. And caring was expensive. It delayed schedules. It brought scrutiny. River commerce thrived on momentum, not reflection. But patterns were forming. Across ports, Natchez, Vicksburg, Greenville, Baton Rouge men vanished who shared something intangible. They were not random laborers. They were not inexperienced deckhands. They were men who spoke too freely about harm they had caused, men who believed the river absolved them simply by carrying them forward. They disappeared not in clusters, but steadily, quietly, just often enough to be noticed by someone who was paying attention. Most were not. River communities learned to accept loss without grief. Grief required attachment, and attachment was risky. Crews changed constantly. Faces blurred together. When someone vanished, the work was redistributed. The empty space filled. No memorials, no prayers, just silence and continuation. Loss was practical, not emotional. It was something to manage, not mourn. Families upriver waited for letters that never came. Some assumed abandonment. Others assumed death. Most never learned which. On the river, uncertainty was kinder than truth. It allowed people to move on without confronting the reality of what had been lost. Elias Crow noticed the growing pattern, even as others refused to. He saw the names come and go. He saw the gaps where people should have been. He heard the same kinds of stories from different mouths in different towns. And each time a disappearance was explained away, he felt something settle into place. Not satisfaction, but confirmation. Still, nothing about the vanishings felt dramatic. There were no chases, no screams, no witnesses running to authorities. The river absorbed everything. Storms erased footprints. Currents erased bodies. Time erased concern. The Mississippi did what it had always done: carry on. That was what made the pattern so easy to ignore. Months passed. Then years. The disappearances continued at a measured pace. Not enough to draw attention, but too consistent to be random. Men vanished after arguments, after inspections, after delays that seemed inconvenient but harmless. Boats left later than planned. Paperwork took longer than expected. Small changes that no one questioned because no one believed they mattered. The river community adapted the way it always had by lowering its expectations. Fewer questions were asked. Fewer names were remembered. Loss became background noise, as constant and unremarkable as the creak of wood or the slap of water against hulls. People learned not to look too closely at empty bunks or abandoned belongings. Looking invited thought, and thought invited responsibility. What frightened Elias most was not how easily men disappeared, but how easily they were replaced. New faces arrived daily, eager, desperate, anonymous. The river never ran out of people willing to step in the gaps left behind. Life did not pause. Commerce did not slow. The Mississippi demanded movement, not memory. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, something was accumulating. Not bodies, those were scattered and lost, but absences. Stories unfinished, names no longer spoken. A quiet imbalance growing with every disappearance that went unexamined. To the river towns, these were coincidences. To the captains, they were inconveniences. To the families left behind, they were unanswered questions that eventually faded into resignation. But to Elias Crow, they were entries waiting to be acknowledged. The tension lay not in what the river took, but in what it was allowed to take without resistance. The disappearances did not shock the community because the community had trained itself not to be shocked. In doing so, it surrendered something essential, the belief that every life required recognition. And that surrender, Elias believed, was more dangerous than the river itself. Because when loss becomes normal, it stops feeling like loss at all. It becomes routine. And routine, unchecked, is where the most unsettling patterns are allowed to grow unnoticed, slipping quietly downstream, carried by a current no one dares to question. Elias Crow never touched anyone. That was the truth he returned to whenever doubt crept in, whenever the weight of what he was doing pressed too heavily on his thoughts. He carried no weapon. He raised no hand in anger. There were no bruises left by him, no blood on his clothes, no moments that could be pointed to as acts of violence. If asked if such a question had ever occurred to anyone, Elias would have said, honestly, that he had never harmed a soul. He believed this without hesitation. What Elias understood, better than most, was how fragile order already was on the river. Everything depended on timing, on weight, on sequence. A delayed departure could change an entire journey. A missing inspection could invite disaster. A small shift in schedule could place a boat in the river at exactly the wrong moment. Elias's job as a clerk gave him quite influence over all of it. Paperwork was power on the docks. Cargo had to be recorded. Fees had to be confirmed. Departure times had to be approved. These processes were meant to create order, but in practice, they were flexible, rushed, and often treated as inconveniences. Elias knew which captains hated delays and which ignored them. He knew who skimmed paperwork and who trusted him completely. His reputation for precision worked in his favor. When Elias said something needed checking, no one argued. When he asked for a delay, it was granted without suspicion. Sometimes the change was small. A boat left an hour later than planned, pushing it into a fog bank upriver. Sometimes it was a late inspection that forced crewmen to stay aboard longer, tension simmering overnight. Sometimes it was a corrected cargo weight that shifted balance just enough to make a vessel less forgiving in rough water. Elias never engineered catastrophe. He never guaranteed an outcome. He only removed safeguards that men had already taken for granted. Arguments that might have cooled off were given time to fester. Drunk men were left together longer than intended. Storms that could have been avoided were met head-on. The river was unforgiving to carelessness, and Elias understood carelessness intimately. He did not create it. He recognized it and allowed it to continue. When men vanished, Elias felt no surprise. The river had done what it always did. It corrected imbalance. It punished weight, excess arrogance, excess cruelty. He believed the Mississippi was not a killer but a force of consequence. And consequence, Elias thought, did not require intention. This distinction mattered deeply to him. In his mind, killers acted directly. They sought control. They imposed their will through violence. Elias did none of that. He did not decide who would die. He decided who would no longer be protected from what the river already was. If a man fell overboard during a storm, it was the storm that killed him. If a fight ended badly near a railing, it was the fight. Elias simply ensured that chance was allowed to run its course. To Elias, this was the difference between interference and correction. He compared his actions to balancing a ledger. If numbers did not add up, you did not invent new figures. You adjusted until the truth revealed itself. The river, he believed, was the ultimate ledger. It recorded everything in its own way, erasing what did not belong. Elias only made sure the entries were accurate. He never rushed the process. Some men were written into his private ledger long before anything happened to them. Others remained there indefinitely, names waiting without resolution. Elias did not feel urgency. The river was patient. Time, he believed, was not an obstacle, but a tool. If a man truly belonged to the river, the moment would come. And sometimes, nothing happened at all. This did not trouble Elias. It confirmed his belief that he was not in control. He was not executing judgment, he was witnessing it. When a man written into the ledger reached the next port safely, Elias did not intervene further. He did not escalate. He did not force circumstances. He accepted the outcome as the river's decision. This restraint was central to how he saw himself. Elias Crow was not a vigilante. He did not seek to cleanse the river of evil or impose moral order on the world. He did not believe he was better than the men who vanished. He believed only that someone had to remember what others chose to forget. His job gave him proximity, not authority. He used that proximity carefully, quietly, without spectacle. The river did the final act every time. It swallowed bodies. It scattered evidence. It provided explanations no one questioned. Elias never attended funerals because there were none. He never saw grieving families because the river kept them far away. He experienced the consequences only through absence-empty bunks, crossed-out names, quieter docks. When he returned to his room at night, he did not wash blood from his hands. He sharpened his pencil. He opened the ledger. He wrote. This ritual grounded him. It reaffirmed his identity as a clerk, a recorder, someone whose role was to document reality rather than shape it. Even as the pattern grew clearer, even as disappearances aligned too neatly to be coincidence, Elias resisted the idea that he was responsible. Responsibility implied intention, and Elias believed intention belonged to the river alone. That belief allowed him to sleep. In his mind, the most dangerous people were not those who acted, but those who ignored. Those who heard confessions and laughed. Those who saw disappearance and shrugged. Those who allowed the river to erase without question. Elias saw himself as standing between indifference and acknowledgement. Not to punish, but to preserve truth. If the river chose to take someone after that, It was not his doing. He was only keeping the books. The flood did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself the way the Mississippi always did, slowly, relentlessly, with a confidence that made resistance feel pointless. Weeks of heavy rain upriver swelled the banks, raising the water inch by inch until docks disappeared beneath brown currents and boats strained against their moorings. In Natchez, people had seen floods before. They moved goods to higher ground, reinforced doors, waited. The river had moods, and this was just another one. Or so they believed. Then the water kept rising. Warehouses closest to the river went first. Their foundations, weakened by decades of damp and neglect, gave way under the pressure. Walls cracked. Floors collapsed inward. Mud and debris poured through streets that had once bustled with trade. Entire sections of the riverfront were swallowed, buildings tilting as if bowing to something older and stronger than themselves. When the flood finally receded days later, Natchez was left scarred structures broken open, their contents exposed to daylight for the first time in years. Among the ruins was a shuttered fish shop near Dock Number 3. It had been abandoned for decades, its upper room long rumored to have once housed a clerk who left quietly and was never replaced by memory. During cleanup, workers clearing debris noticed something unusual beneath the collapsed floorboards. A wooden chest wedged tightly between beams, sealed and remarkably intact. Its exterior was darkened with age, its iron latch rusted shut. No one expected much from it. Old buildings often hid junk tools, spoiled goods, forgotten personal effects. But when the chest was pried open, it revealed something unexpected. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of oilcloth, was a book, a ledger. The pages were swollen and stained, edges curled from long exposure to moisture. Ink had run in places, blurring words into shadows. But much of it was still legible. The handwriting was careful, consistent, unmistakably deliberate. This was not a casual notebook. It was not a merchant's account or a personal diary. It was something else entirely. When the ledger was brought to historians studying the flood's impact, curiosity turned quickly to unease. The entries did not list cargo or money. They listed names, dozens of them, each accompanied by a date and a port along the Mississippi River. Some entries included a short sentence, cryptic, restrained, almost clinical. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. Then the names were compared to records, shipping manifests, port logs, newspaper notices of missing men, crew lists that ended abruptly. One by one, patterns emerged. Every name in the ledger belonged to someone who had vanished along the river in the 1830s and 1840s. Men whose disappearances had been dismissed as accidents, illness, or simple desertion. Men whose stories had never been resolved because no one had thought them important enough to pursue. The dates aligned. The ports matched. The disappearances made sense in a way they never had before. Historians were careful with their conclusions. The ledger did not prove murder. It did not describe acts of violence. It did not even explain intent. But it did something more unsettling. It demonstrated awareness. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had been watching disappearances, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern. And that raised a question no one had considered at the time. How many of these men vanished by chance? And how many vanished because someone allowed circumstances to unfold in a particular way? As the pages were examined more closely, another detail emerged. The handwriting never changed, not once. Over years of entries, the same careful script appeared again and again, steady and patient. This was not the work of multiple hands. It was the work of one person. A clerk, perhaps, someone with access to ports, someone trusted. Toward the back of the ledger, the entries grew fewer. The handwriting remained precise, but there was more space between names. The river world had changed by then, steamships replacing flatboats, schedules tightening, oversight increasing. Disappearances still happened, but not as easily. The ledger reflected that shift, growing quieter as the river grew louder. Then came the final page. Unlike the others, it contained only one entry: a name, a date, no port, no sentence. The name was Elias Crow. Beneath it, written smaller than any other line in the book, were two words: balance complete. There were no further pages. No explanation followed. No conclusion offered. Elias Crow did not appear in death records. No burial site was ever identified. Like so many others in the ledger, he simply vanished, absorbed into the same river he had spent his life observing. The discovery unsettled historians not because it revealed a killer, but because it revealed a mindset. The ledger did not scream guilt or innocence. It suggested something quieter and far more disturbing: that in a place where no one wanted to remember, one man had taken it upon himself to do exactly that. The flood had destroyed much of Natchez' past, but it had also exposed something that had been hidden deliberately. The river, in receding, had returned what it had once been asked to keep. And in doing so, it raised a final lingering question: whether Elias Crow had been erased by the river, or whether at last he had simply written himself into its memory and let it take him the way it took everyone else. The final entry in the ledger is brief. There is no flourish to it, no explanation, no defense. Written in the same careful hand as all the others, it reads simply: Elias Crow, balance complete. Two words that close a book decades in the making. Two words that refuse to explain themselves. They sit on the page without apology, without emotion, as if nothing more needed to be said. And maybe, to Elias, nothing did. He did not write that he was finished. He did not write that he was forgiven or condemned. Only that the balance was complete. As though the work had never been about him at all. What lingers after reading those words is not certainty, but unease. Because the ledger does not offer the comfort of a clear villain. Elias Crow does not fit neatly into the shape of a monster. He did not stalk victims. He did not chase power or pleasure. He did not leave behind scenes of violence meant to shock or terrify. Instead, he listened. He observed. He recorded. And in a world where the law had already abandoned responsibility, he quietly decided that someone should remember what others chose to forget. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable question about justice itself. We are used to thinking of justice as something formal: courts, trials, punishment. But along the Mississippi, in 1838, those systems barely existed. Men vanished without names, without records, without anyone willing to slow down long enough to care. The law did not fail loudly. It failed quietly, through absence. And into that absence stepped someone who believed that acknowledgement mattered more than punishment. That being seen, even once, was a form of reckoning. Was Elias wrong? That depends on where you believe justice comes from. If justice requires authority, procedure, and restraint, then Elias was deeply flawed. He acted alone. He answered to no one. He allowed circumstances to unfold without intervention, knowing what might happen. He replaced collective responsibility with private judgment. And that is a dangerous thing. History is full of people who believed they were correcting imbalance, only to create something far worse. But if justice begins with truth, if it begins with refusing to let cruelty dissolve into silence, then Elias becomes harder to dismiss. He did not invent crimes. He did not exaggerate them. He wrote down what men said when they believed they were untouchable. He preserved words spoken freely, proudly, without remorse. And he did so in a place where no one else bothered to listen. In that sense, Elias was not imposing morality on the river. He was documenting it. That is why the question lingers. Was Elias Crow a monster, or was he a mirror? Did he create the pattern of disappearances, or did he simply notice what everyone else refused to see? Did he exploit the river's danger, or did he accept its nature more honestly than those who pretended it was harmless? The ledger does not answer these questions. It was never meant to. It only records. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. The story does not end with resolution or justice served. It ends with memory, with a name written down one last time, with the suggestion that accountability does not always arrive wearing the uniform we expect. Sometimes it arrives quietly, unnoticed, disguised as routine. The Mississippi River still flows south. It passes the same towns, the same bends, the same quiet stretches where water moves slowly enough to reflect the sky. Boats still travel it. Goods still move along its surface. And people still disappear, though now we like to believe we understand why. But rivers are patient. They have outlasted laws, nations, and names. They carry history, whether we acknowledge it or not. And maybe that is what Elias Crow understood best. That the river does not judge in the way humans do. It does not care about innocence or guilt. It remembers weight, imbalance, and neglect. It remembers what is allowed to happen when no one is watching. And when we choose not to remember, the river remembers for us. So the question remains with you. Not whether Elias Crow was right or wrong, but what it means when systems fail and someone decides to keep score anyway. Is that justice? Or is it something far more dangerous? Let me know what you think. Was Elias a monster? Or was he simply reflecting the darkness that already existed on the river? Share your interpretation in the comments. Because the river still flows. And it still remembers.